Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Dear student teachers, today we are going to look at lecture 8 of Functional English 1 for Associate Degree in Education. Lecture 8 is actually a continuation of lecture 7. In lecture 7, you learned how to carry out instructions, how to give instructions, or how to follow instructions. So we are going to continue with that, and in lecture 8 we are going to look at a particular situation, that is classroom instructions. I think in lecture 7 we talked a lot about the utility of instructions in the classroom. So in lecture 8 we are going to look at classroom instructions in detail. And we will also learn in lecture 8 writing instructions manuals, writing instruction manuals. But before we move on with the contents of the lecture number 8, I would like you to have a quick recap of what we learned in lecture number 7. And it is really very important because lecture 7 is followed in lecture 8, and because lecture 8 is actually built on what we learned already in lecture 7. In fact, you would find that some of the skills, some of the key points that we studied in the previous lecture are repeated for your convenience, in order to provide you more practice. So let's look at the review of lecture number 7 first. In lecture 7, we learned how to follow instructions, how to carry out instructions. We also learned how to structure clear instructions. If you can recall, I gave you an activity of mashed potato exercise in which you were presented with a set of instructions about how to make mashed potatoes. But you learned that how to make mashed potatoes was not very clear, it was not brief, it was not to the point. So there were a lot of things that we had to cross out. There were a lot of things that we had to delete in order to make it more effective and in order to make it brief and comprehensive. After that, we learned how to use time connective words. We also learned use of action words, and I hope that, as I advised you, to make a list of action words related to different skills. For example, related to lecturing, related to studying, related to exams, related to evaluation, etc. Then in lecture number 7, we also learned how to set conditions for actions. And if you can recall, we learned 2 ways of setting conditions for these actions. One was using participle phrases, using present participle, which was ing form of the verb. We learned how to set conditions for actions. In lecture number 7, we also learned how to give oral instructions. And I gave you various practice situations, and I asked you to find a partner. First, I asked you to plan and write it down, and then find a partner and give oral instructions on various situations to your partner. And I hope that you have completed those tasks, because as I said earlier, without you actively participating in the course, it is very difficult to become a proficient speaker of English. So if you really want to learn English speaking, listening, reading and writing skills, you need to cooperate and you need to put in practice everything that I have given in these lectures. In today's lecture, we are going to learn how to give clear instructions in the classroom. And I would appreciate if you actually practice it in your classrooms. And the best way to do that is to be well planned. Plan your lesson in ahead, especially if you are going to conduct any activity in the classroom. Let's look at that, but let me first ask you some questions. Sorry, before the questions, we are going to look at the objectives of lecture number 8. After completing lecture number 8, you should be able to, number 1, evaluate classroom instructions. That means you will listen to some classroom instructions. You would actually read out some classroom instructions, and you would evaluate them. You would find them out how useful they are in the classroom situation. So using your own teaching experience, I would like you to critically think about the classroom instructions that you are going to read, and then give your own feedback how we can improve these classroom instructions. So it will be like improving upon instructions, classroom instructions, just as we improved upon a recipe of how to make mashed potatoes in the previous lecture. Okay, the next objective of lecture number 8 is to give clear classroom instructions. And of course, this is related to the first objective. Once we understand how instructions are given, we can actually use clear instructional pattern to use it in our own classes. The third objective that we are going to look at is how to order classroom instructions. And by order here I mean placing it in a proper order. Whether you write it in a bullet form, whether you write it in a lettered list, whether you write it in a numbered list. But it should follow a particular order, usually a chronological order. And by chronological order I mean you will mention first what happens first. You know, in time things happen in a series. Action 1 precedes action 2. So you should mention action 1 earlier than action 2. This is called chronological order. I repeat, chronological order means that if you explain or mention things in the order as they happen, as they actually happen. So what happens earlier, you mention it earlier. This is called chronological order. So we will learn how to give classroom instructions in a proper order. We'll also learn how to check classroom instructions. This is really important. Very often we complain that I have explained a topic for 1 hour in the class and no student was paying attention. Especially when we give an activity to our students, and after explaining the whole procedure, how to do an activity in the classroom, we find out that the students have missed out plenty of things. We find out that they were not following our instructions properly. Maybe it is because they were not attentive, but it could also be because our instructions are not clear. So what we need to do is that after giving instructions, we need to ask questions from them. These questions will make them attentive, and these questions would also make us aware whether our students are following our instructions or not. And I think you know that it is an important classroom technique that while teaching, even if you are lecturing or you are teaching a skill, it is very useful asking questions in order to find out whether the students are following it or not. So this is what I mean by checking classroom instructions. So we are going to check classroom instructions by asking some simple questions. Then we will also learn in lecture number 8 how to analyze instruction manuals. So we will look at different kinds of instruction manuals. If you can recall, we looked at some kind of instructional manuals in lecture number 7. Yes, you are right. We will look at that again, and one of the instructional manuals could be the guidebooks that come along with our electronic gadgets. For example, when you buy a camera, you have a small booklet that explains on how to use it. It is called a user guidebook. You can also call it an instructional manual or an operating manual. In fact, there are different names, and we will look at it in detail when we actually come to that point. We move on. The last objective of lecture number 8 is to write instruction manuals itself. So it may sound very ambitious, and it might be intimidating. You might feel frightened that how on earth you are going to write instructional manuals. Your English is very weak, and teacher has not taught any grammar yet, and how does he expect from us to write instructional manuals? Now, let me tell you at the very beginning that although grammar is very important for writing anything, but in fact it is the conventions and it is the key phrases and structures that are more important than grammar itself. So although we will look at grammar from time to time, but mostly we will look at the conventions and the grammar structures and the useful phrases that compose or that go in the process of writing such instructional manuals. So these are the objectives of lecture number 8, and I hope you would attentively follow me and bear with me if I explain a little too much, because all the students are not equal. Some of the students, they actually need more explaining than the others. So I would go slowly, I would repeat a lot of ideas, and I would expect that you would pay attention throughout this lecture. Let me start lecture number 8 then with some simple questions. Let me ask you a very simple question, and that is, how often do you conduct classroom activities? I know in teacher training workshops you are often asked this question. How often do you conduct classroom activities? So what's your answer? Very often? Once a week? Once a month? Once a year? Or you never do any activity in the classroom? You simply go into the classroom, deliver a lecture, and come back. Is that so? Well, I know that there are some classroom activities that we all engage in as teachers. For example, if there is a class test going on, if there is an exam going on, our students are engaged in examination activity, in test activity. But very often they are sitting passively. They just listen to us, and some of them don't even listen. They pretend that they are listening, and there is hardly any activity for them to do. Sometimes we use some activities such as dictation, such as reciting something from the previous lesson. If you are an English teacher, you can ask them to read out a passage from their book. Sometimes we ask comprehension questions for them, but usually we do not engage our students in pair works, in group work. So when I say classroom activity, in fact I am referring to pair work, group work, and those kind of activities in which our learners are actively involved. So how often do you conduct classroom activities then? I'm not talking about exam or test activities. I'm talking about active learning, when students or learners are actively engaged in learning. Probably not much. So if you have not been very frequently using classroom activities, I think it is time that you start doing it now. because according to the educationists, children or students learn what they do. They don't just learn what we say. In fact, they learn by practicing it. They learn by doing it. Okay, probably this was too much of an introduction. Let's move on to the next question. And that is, when you set up such activities, assuming that you do set up such activities in your classes, do your students sometimes look confused? Now be honest with me, because I know that my students sometimes feel confused. And when I find out why they are confused, sometimes they are to be blamed, but most of the times I am to be blamed, because my instructions are not clear, because I have not given enough time to plan it beforehand. So I would say that most of the times my students look confused while doing an activity because I have not given much thought to it, because I have not chalked out the activity very well. If I had given a little more time in planning and writing down what I would do actually in the class, and I had not just relied on my long experience, then probably my students would not have looked so confused. So I am assuming that sometimes your students also feel confused because the instructions are not clear. Well, of course there could be other factors also, but right now we are not going to focus on those. Right now I am only going to focus, what do you do if your students feel or look confused because of your unclear instructions? Well, before we learn the art of clear instructions, let's look at a situation. Let's do a little task here. We'll do this task together, and just be patient. I'll explain what you are expected to do in this task. Task 1. Now we are just going to imagine that there is a teacher whose name is Simon, and Simon is giving instructions to his pre-intermediate students. He is teaching a group of pre-intermediate students. Okay. Now let's look at his instructions first. They are written in blue here, and for your convenience I'm going to read them out. Simon says, so what I would like you to do is this. First of all, I would like you to imagine you are a waiter. Well, that's student A. If you were the waiter, what would you do? And student B, if you were the customer, what would you say? Oh, that's right. Guys, you will all need to look at the menu. Actually, you both will. Okay, so you do that and talk together. All right? Okay, so what do you have to do? And you know, in response to this, the students only show silence. And I think after reading these instructions, probably you yourself are also confused. You don't know what to do. Well, because of your experience in teaching, probably you would guess what the teacher wants, what Simon wants here, but I think it would be difficult for the students to follow it. Anyway, I want you, task 1 is to look at Simon's instructions and then answer the questions given at the bottom of the screen. I would read them out for your convenience. Question number A is, do you think Simon's instructions are clear and easy to understand? Do you think Simon's instructions are clear and easy to understand? If your answer is no, then definitely you need to give details why you think so. If your answer is yes, again, you need to give reasons why you think so. Okay, question B is, Can you improve Simon's instructions? Rewrite them on a piece of paper. Okay. So I would like you to look at these instructions here, and you should rewrite them so that they look better, so that you can improve upon them. Okay, we move on. Let's look at these two questions now again. Okay, question number 1, or question A was, do you think Simon's instructions are clear and easy to understand? The answer is no. They are neither clear nor easy to understand. Why? They are likely to be difficult. Likely to be difficult means they are expected to be difficult. Likely means expected. They are likely to be difficult for pre-intermediate level learners. Remember here, pre-intermediate is like our SSC students. Simon realizes at the end he needs to check his instructions, and this is a positive thing. You can recall that in the end he says, if I go back to the previous slide and look at the last sentence by Simon, he says, okay, so what do you have to do? In other words, he is asking his students to repeat the procedure, to repeat the set of instructions that he gave. So Simon realizes at the end he needs to check his instructions, and this is a positive thing. It's a good thing. However, his way of checking is asking students to repeat the whole instruction sequence, and this is difficult. But the way he is checking whether the students have followed his instructions or not is difficult, because what he is asking his students is to repeat the whole sequence, repeat the whole instructions. In fact, he should have asked a specific question rather than asking the students to repeat the whole sequence. So the answer to the first question, the answer to question A is that no, these are not easy for the pre-intermediate students to follow, and these instructions are not clear. Okay, if these instructions are not clear and easy, then definitely we lead on to the next step, and that is how to make these instructions clear and easy. And that was our second question today. Can you improve Simon's instructions? Rewrite them on a piece of paper. And I'm sure you have written them down, and compare it with the answer here. Remember, there are many possible ways of rewriting Simon's instructions. So maybe your instructions differ with mine, but definitely they might be as good as mine, or maybe better than what I have provided here. The following example would be easier for students to understand. So just take it as one option. Don't think that this is the only right way of giving instructions, but this could be one way. So instead of starting with the instructions as he did, Simon this time could say, okay, student A, you are all waiters. Student B, you are all customers. So who are the waiters? The A's raise their hands. And who are the customers? The B's raise their hands. Great. All the waiters and all the customers read the menu. Customers, think about what you are going to say. Waiters, think about what you will reply. Now, what will you do first? Read the menu or speak? Okay, now let's analyze this time. First of all, I think although these instructions are now clear enough, but I believe that in most of our classes, such pair work and group work activities are not very common, so we need to make it even clearer. If your students already know how to form pairs, how to form groups, then probably these instructions are clear enough. But if you are doing it for the first time, or if your students are not yet, you can say, not yet used to such activities, then probably you would first form pairs. And you know, there are different ways of forming pairs. One way which has been mentioned here could be that you ask each student to speak A or B for themselves. So first student sitting on your right says, I am A. Next student says B. Next student says A. Next student says B. So in this way, the whole class alternately says A or B. And then in the end, you can ask all A's to raise their hands. You can ask all B's to raise their hands. You can ask A to sit next to B. So this could be one strategy of forming pairs. And since you are learning AID, which is Associated Degree in Education, I'm sure that you have learned other ways of forming pairs as well. Once your students have are able to form pairs, then you can say, okay, students A, you are all waiters. Students B, you are all customers. And then rather than asking a general question, you can check whether students have understood this much. So you can say, so who are the waiters? And in response to this, all A's raise their hands. And when you say who are the customers, all B raise their hands. So instead of giving the whole procedure, whole set of instructions, and then then asking the students to repeat all the steps, it is better that I partially check it. And after just the first or second step, I stop for a while and check whether the students are following me or not. Great. All the waiters and all the customers read the menu. That's the next step. And then Simon tells them, customers, think about what you are going to say. Waiters, think about what you will reply. So these two instructions would actually help the customers and the waiters to think ahead before they can say anything. Now the customers know what they are going to say, and the waiters, they prepare to reply their customers. And in the end, Simon says, now what will you do first? Read the menu or speak? So you see, this time he has asked a question which is not a general question. In fact, it gives them two options: whether you are going to read the menu or whether you are going to read, whether they are going to read the menu or whether they are going to speak. So definitely their answers should be read the menu first. Okay. So this is one way you can improve Simon's instructions, right? Of course, there are ways you can even make it clearer if you spend more time on it, if you plan it. Probably you can find even easier ways, better ways to instruct. It all comes with experience, and it all comes with hard work and planning. Okay, so what is the key point that we have learned in task number 1? In task 1, we have mainly learned 2 points. Number 1, when teachers can give clear instructions, learners feel more secure in the lesson. And I think you can imagine it very well now, because although you are teachers, but right now in this class you are students. So anytime I don't give clear instructions, you do feel insecure, don't you? So in order to make your learners feel secure in the class, you should actually give clear instructions. You should give them slowly, you should give them clearly, and you should make sure that your students are following you by asking them questions. Okay, in task 1 we also learned that giving clear instruction also means learners can begin tasks more quickly, which increases time for learning. So maybe in the beginning you spend a lot of time planning these instructions, but once you have given clear instructions, actually it would save time. Actually students would be able to move on to the activity earlier than if the instructions had not been clear. Okay, so the reason why we need to give clear instructions is instructions are because learners would feel more secure and learners would be able to start the activity quickly without wasting time. Okay, we move on to task number 2. Task 2 is finding out hints for giving clear instructions. So here is my instruction. First, read it out. I have written it in bold type. Look at each pair of sentences and choose the one that is true. Okay, so the first pair is A, you should use polite language, otherwise students will get offended. A, you should use polite language, otherwise students will get offended. B, you should use simple language so the instructions are clear. So which one do you think is true? If you said B, you are right. You should use simple language so the instructions are clear. In fact, for instructions, you remember we use imperative sentences, and imperative sentences start with an action word. Imperative sentences are usually given for orders, for commands. So for clear instructions, in fact, you rather than using any polite structures that might confuse your students or that might make the instructions very difficult to comprehend, very lengthy ones, you should use simple language to give the instructions clearly. Okay, let's look at question number 2, pair number 2. A, you shouldn't do a demonstration because it takes far too much time. B, you should do a demonstration so students can see the activity in action. So what do you say? Which one is correct, A or B? Those of you who said B, they are right. You should do a demonstration so students can see the activity in action. Because as they say, seeing is believing, right? Students actually learn more when they see something being performed in front of them rather than merely listening to it. So demonstration is useful technique, and in fact it should be part of your oral instructions. Okay, let's look at pair number 3. A, you should use questions to check key aspects of the instructions. B, you should use questions to check all aspects of the instructions. So what's your answer? Which one is true, A or B? Yeah, this time A is true, because you should use questions to check key aspects of the instructions. You don't need to ask questions, such questions like, do you understand? Do you understand really doesn't make much sense because it is vague question. Similarly, we only need to understand key aspects of the instructions. We don't want them to repeat the whole set of instructions. We don't need them to check, we don't need to check all aspects of instructions, because if they have understood the key aspects of the instructions, that is enough. So option A is true. Let's look at pair number 4. A, You should hold up worksheets when giving instructions so that students look at you. B. You should hand out worksheets and then give instructions so students can read what they have to do. So what's your answer? A or B? Which one is true? That's right. This time again, A is true. You should hold up worksheets when giving instructions so that students look at you. And I think the reason is quite obvious. If you are going to conduct an activity in the classroom and you have handouts or worksheets to distribute, you know what happens if you distribute these worksheets among the students? Yes, without listening to your instructions, they start reading it. So what should we do? We should hold these worksheets so that the students listen to you and they look at you. Once you have given oral instructions and once you have checked, you can give the worksheets and they can start looking at it again. Okay, so we have looked at 4 pairs. Let's move on and continue with few more pairs. Okay, a pair of sentence. Next one is number 5 is A. You shouldn't use gesture as this will distract students from what you are saying. B. You should use gesture because visual information can support what you are saying. So what do you say to this? A or B? Yeah, those of you who say B, they are right. You should use gesture because visual information can support what you are saying. And if you can recall, in chapter number 7, I emphasized illustrations. So whenever you are writing instructions, you should include illustrations or photographs or pictures. Because one picture is worth 1,000 words. But if you are giving your instructions orally in the classroom, you can accompany it with useful gestures because gestures can convey a lot of information. And you know that maybe in associate degree in education, you also learnt that your learners, they are of varied types. Some learners learn through images, other learners learn through words, some learners learn through actions or activities, some learners learn through music. So different learners actually use different learning strategies to learn, and we need to use a variety of strategies. In short, we should use gestures to accompany our instructions, and that would those gestures would make it even more interesting, more lively, and also more effective. Okay, let's look at the last pair, pair number 6. A. You should never use the OHP or overhead projector to help you give instructions because it is awkward and it is really a bit like cheating if you do. B. You should sometimes use an OHP to help you give instructions because you can show a transparency of a worksheet clearly to your learners. Yes, if your answer is B, you are right. I think sometimes you should use OHP, overhead projector, or if you have a blackboard or a whiteboard, or like when you are listening to these videos, you see along with me, you also find my slides displayed on the screen. So when I give instructions, they are easy for you to follow because you also look at the screen, because you also look at the slides, and you listen to my instructions. So B is correct. Sometimes we should use OHP or other tools in order to make our instructions clear. Okay, we move on to the learning point of task 2. It is helpful for students if teachers plan their instructions. So the important word here is plan. You must plan your instructions beforehand. If your instructions are planned, your students won't feel confused. Good instructions use simple language and are often supported by clear gestures or demonstrations. So you should use clear language, and you should accompany your language or your verbal message along with gestures or with demonstrations. You can also use a whiteboard or an OHP for giving instructions clearly. And finally, you should remember to ask questions in order to check your students have understood the instructions correctly. Without asking questions, or simply by asking general questions such as have you understood, I don't think it will be really helpful. Okay, we move on to task number 3. Task 3 is getting instructions in the right order. You remember Simon started giving instructions about his activity in the wrong order, and that's why his students were silent. That's why his students felt confused. And when we improved upon his instructions, we actually reordered some of the instructions that he was giving. Ordering is really very important. If we give proper order, only then we can give clear instructions. Now here you have instructions written from A to F. These are teacher action orders, and I want you to write 1, 2, 3 next to these 6 sentences or instructions. So which one of these do you think should be the first one? Whether it should be giving instructions, whether it should be hand out the worksheet, hold up the worksheet, gesture the interaction pattern to be used, get the student's attention, or check the instructions. What should be the first one? Yes, the first step should be E, get the student's attention. Because if you start giving instructions straight away without getting their attention first, I think you know what will happen. So the first step would be E, get the student's attention. Okay, now I'm going to display the key to this so that you can find out whether your answers were correct or not. So look at the key, and then we will discuss each point separately. Here is the key. Okay, so step E is 1, get the student's attention. Step C is 2, hold up the worksheet. Hold up is the opposite of give away. So do not give away the worksheets, hold them up. Step 3 is A, which is give instructions. Step 4 is D, which is gesture the interaction pattern to be used, like work in pairs or something like that. Step 5 is F, which is check the instructions. And step 6 is B, which is hand out the worksheet. Yes, you check the instructions before you even hand out the worksheet. Once you are satisfied that your students have understood the instructions very well, they can answer your questions regarding the key aspects of your instructions, only then you are going to hand out the worksheet. So handing out the worksheet is going to be the last step, and getting the students' attention is going to be the first step. Okay, so if I hope that your answers were right, and you can compare it with the key now. Okay, we move on. What did we learn from task number 3? What was the learning point, the key focal element? In class, before you begin giving your instructions, ensure that all the students are looking at you and listening to you. It's important not give out the worksheet too early, otherwise you will lose your students' attention. Only give out the worksheet once you have finished giving and checking your instructions. So these are the points that we learned, and I think you would keep them in mind while you give instructions in your class in future. Okay, now let's move on to task number 4. And task number 4 is checking instructions. So here are the instructions. First, I've written them in bold. Each number below from 1 to 6 is a learning activity, and I have underlined the learning activity. For example, in number 1, the learning activity is role play. After each activity, there are 2 questions, A and B, that could be used to check the instructions. One question is effective, but the other is not. Choose the question that you think is most effective. So if you just look at number 1, okay, number 1, activity number 1 is role play. If you are going to conduct role play in the classroom, which question should you ask, A or B? Which one is more effective and which one is useless? Yes, but before you answer A or B, let's have a quick recap of what actually role play is. Role play is when you give a role to your students to play in front of the class. So like a customer and a waiter, these are 2 roles that they have to play in the class. So if you split the whole class into pairs, and in each pair one of the student is a waiter, another of the other student is the customer, and then you give them the worksheet, this means that they know how to work in pairs. Okay, now this is role play. So which question do you think is more effective for role play? A, are you going to write or speak together? B, who speaks first? Yes, those of you who say B are right, because normally you see for role play you don't need to write anything. You can just jot down some notes maybe sometimes, but the main question is here, who speaks first? Who starts? Whether the customer is going to start or whether the waiter is going to start. So there is a key aspect. Okay, activity number 2 is mingle. So if you are using this activity in the classroom, which question do you think is more effective, A or B? A is, do you ask your partner or other students? B, do you mingle around? Mingle around means mix around, right? And this is pretty obvious, so you don't need to ask B. Question A is more appropriate here, which is, do you ask your partner or other students? So if you ask this question from your students, if when you are conducting mingle activity, you ask your students, do you ask your partner or other students? Definitely their answer should be, they would ask other students. Okay. All right. Activity number 3 is gist reading, and there are 2 questions. Are you going to read or listen, and how much time have you got? Again, you know, from the activity itself, gist reading means that it is a reading activity, so the students are not going to listen, definitely. So the first question is pretty obvious, and it shouldn't be asked. Instead, we should ask, how much time have you got? Because for gist reading, it is important that after reading a passage, students get out the gist or the main idea quickly. And usually for gist reading, we give them time to complete this activity. Okay, number 4. Activity number 4 is information gap activity. And as you know, information gap activity is in which if you are working in pairs, one of the partners has the information and other wants to know about it. And the other usually asks questions in order to find out that information. In information gap activity, you can ask which question do you think is more effective? A, are you going to show your sheet to each other? B, so what are you going to talk about? Yes, option B is correct. What are you going to ask about? Because they are not going to show their sheets to each other. It is an information gap activity, and if they show the sheet to each other, it mars the purpose of the activity, and there is no information gap left then. In fact, the point is that one student has the information and the other student seeks that information by asking questions or through oral interaction. If both of them look at the same sheet, worksheet, then there is no information gap and there is no purpose of communication. So, what are you going to talk about would be a better question, more effective question. Okay, number 5, gap fill activity. Are you going to fill in the gap, or do you use only one word or more than one word? Again, you see, if it is a gap fill activity, you don't need to ask a question, are you going to fill in the gap? Instead, you would ask a question, do you use only one word or more than one word in the gap? That would be more appropriate question. Okay, we move on to the next activity, which is pretty useful, which is very common in our situations. It is called dictation. And there are two questions. Which one of them is right? How many times will I read the text? A. And B is, who is going to write down the words? So which one do you think is appropriate? Yes, option B is right. Who is going to write down the words? In fact, question A could also be relevant in some situations. So I won't really say that it is ineffective all the times. Okay, with this we come to the end of first half of first part. We move on to the instruction manuals now. The first question is, what are instruction manuals? There are different names actually. Sometimes we call them manuals, and the word manual is from, I think it is derived from a French word. Originally it might have come from Latin. So all the words that start with man have got something to do with hand. Like, manicure is the cure of hand. Manual is like a handbook. So you do something manually means you do it with your hands, like manual labor, right? So manual is like a handbook, and instruction manual is a guidebook or a handbook in which instructions are given. Can you think of any examples? Well, here you have some types of manuals. How to install a software. When you download a software and you have to install it on the computer, you sometimes, in fact all the times, you have operating manuals along with it. So there are detailed instructions on how to install it on your machine. Similarly, how to assemble a toy. When you purchase a toy from the market and you want to assemble it for your own kid, usually it accompanies, it comes along with an instructional manual on how to assemble it. So there are instructions to assemble it. So this kind of manual is called instruction manual. How to use a gadget. A gadget is like a tool. When you buy a camera, for example, along with it you have a user manual, how to use it. How to apply for a visa. You can get this information from a website or from the embassy of the country that you want to visit. They will usually give you a set of instructions in which they would give their policy and the procedure on how you can apply for a visa. Similarly, manuals are very common in workplaces, like workplace safety. in order to avoid safety hazards. And in teacher training manuals, usually you have course handbook. So you follow the course handbook that you have been provided. Like in this course, Functional English 1, I have been provided with a handbook and I follow it. Okay, how to write effective instructions? First of all, we need to look at the audience and the purpose of instructions. The audience can be a novice who is a first-time user, or the audience could be an experienced audience who has performed a similar task before. So I need to keep in mind both kind of audience. Sometimes you see you are writing an instructional manual for both of these kind of audience, and then you should also know the purpose. We have discussed the purposes earlier. The purpose could be how to use a gadget. The purpose could be how to install a software. So there could be various purposes. The purpose could be to be safe. So the first thing that we need to do is, before we write down anything, we need to look at the audience and purpose of instruction manuals. Okay, and then we need to think what kind of questions audience want to know. Here is a list. Why am I doing this? How do I do it? So if, for example, you are instructing your students on how to make a paper plane, they can ask, why am I doing this? How do I do this? What material or equipment do I need? Where do I begin? What do I do next? And what could go wrong? So once you think or imagine about your audiences, you can look at the questions that they can ask, and your instruction manual should actually address all those questions. Okay, in order to write effective and excellent instructions, there are two ways. One way leads to success, another leads to failure. You need to look at these points here. Your instructions should be clear and limiting, should have limiting title, specific title. You should have informed content. That means you should know about the content yourself before you impart it to the others. There must be visuals in it, pictures, illustrations. There should be appropriate level of detail and technicality. It shouldn't be very technical. It shouldn't be it should depend on the audience, the level of your audience. It should be ordered, properly ordered, and there should be notes and hazard notices. I will look at it in detail. Readability means that it is easy to read, it is in a presentable form, and it has an effective design. It is pleasing to the eyes as well. Let's look at notes and hazard notices. Okay, before that, let's look at an example here. I will provide this to you as a handout so that you can look at it later. Here you have an instruction manual, and it is titled as connection, and it will instruct you how you can connect the cable modem to your computer using either the Ethernet port or the USB port. Okay, and you can see that there is a series of steps here, A, B, C, D, and E. Okay, so you see you have the steps A, B, C, D, and E. And you also see that there are clear, along with these instructions, there are clear pictures. Along with this, there are some other notes as well. Here you have a tick mark where there is a note. In fact, you can have notices, you can have cautions, you can have warnings, and you can have danger. Usually we use these signs in our instruction manuals. The details are given here. Okay, we end with practice situations. These are few situations that you can use. You can design an instruction guide for new students enrolling in the school. You can design a guidebook on how to apply for a library membership card. I would like you to look at these practice situations and at least practice 3 of them. And we are going to look at the summary of today's lecture. In this lecture, we learned how to evaluate classroom instructions, how to give clear classroom instructions, how to order classroom instructions, how to check whether the students have understood the instructions or not. And we have analyzed an instruction manual, and we have also learned how to write instruction manuals. Hope it has been really useful, and hope that you would practice by following the practice situations. Thank you.